ideas about how you create a number set and stuff like that. It's not quite.
He's not just Bertrand Russell's, assisted. It's if anything
No, no,
around, right?
no. But he's quite. One, he taught me the word reification.
Yes.
Everyone else is concerned about abstraction, and
Yes.
he's concerned about things becoming concrete.
Yes. It's a
And
little Hegelian there.
and he, his fallacy of misplaced concreteness about how we mistake our uh, our abstractions, our mathematics,
Yes.
strangely for him, and our logic
Yes.
for reality.
Yes.
So he
Well,
he is pretty interesting.
well, I guess you spend enough time working with Bertrand Russell and all kinds of fallacies will become apparent.
Well, yeah,
I knew a Bertrand Russell worshipper. Bertrand Russell seemed to be some sort of Superman, lit tall buildings and escaped crashing airplanes. And
Yes. Yes. I adored him when I was a teen and tween. It wasn't till later that I read his confessions in his letters to his mistresses, where he admitted how much of his material he'd ripped off from others, and then thrown those other logicians under the bus and said nobody should read those guys in order to cover up what he'd done. And he basically confessed to his mistresses, I like making money, and if I'm a good guy, but if I see an opportunity to make a whole bunch of money by screwing somebody else, I look up later and discover that I did it. And I go, wow, okay, I guess I'm that guy.
well,
okay, that'll work with the devil when he fronts up. Normally, I'm a good guy. I just did a lot of bad things.
That's right. That's what he told his mistress.
I'm being faithful now.
Right, right. To my mistress. Yeah. Yeah, there's some.
But in some ways, he was a good public personality
Sure,
because
highly entertaining.
people, he was so certain. He
Yes.
spoke confidently with certitude, and so often you get philosophers on there, and it depends. Is their only answer, and that's probably the best answer, but that's not exactly what the public is wanting to hear from their
Yeah,
public
that's right.
intellectuals.
That's right. And Russell's takedown of Nietzsche is full of confidence. Of course, it's full of errors too, but that didn't really bother him. It's very persuasive. If only it were, attached to reality, it would be a great essay. But anyway, so why don't we dive in? We have this opportunity to pick up where we left off and roar through paragraph 6 and get into paragraph 7, maybe even this week. We'll see. It's some good material here. I finished reading Cornford's From Religion to Philosophy, and then I went back and developed a whole table of contents for it. It only had a high level table of contents, and I can tell this is a book I have to go back to over and over and over because his definitions of these terms that Kenneth Smith likes to use are really well grounded in the material. And while I was doing that this morning, I found that he was relying on an earlier work by John I. Baer, which is called. Let me just pull this up here. I happen to have it handy. Greek Theories of Elementary Cognition, John I. Baer from 1906, and that book is one of the ones that Cornford was relying on to help him get his basic core terms about aesthesis, gnosis, noesis, and all of these things that we see recurring over and over in Kenneth Smith's writing. So I just started into reading that this morning. I'm in chapter 1. Donald, your hand's up. What's on your mind, sir?
Well, you just reminded me when you went back. As you talked last week, you mentioned, the progression from the oikos to the agora to the polis. That's the same progression, and you probably quite aware. I know Kenneth would be quite aware. On Education in Between Past and Future by Hannah Arendt is exactly the same progression is how you bring a child to adulthood.
Right.
As he proceeds through these spheres of living or domains of living or something.
Yeah.
And it's just, well, great ideas, I guess, run and, they're all the same wherever you find them.
Well, it's very Hegelian, right? That this idea that they're not separate abstract categories, but that they're stages of development we pass through. And some people stop in an earlier stage of development and don't get any further, and other people, get to the point where they're chafing at the bit to move past that. And you have to let them develop that, whatever their arete is, whatever the course of their teleological development. It's only a just society if it nurtures their ability to find that aspect of life that's the fullest expression of their inner character. You can't force. I mean, if you won't let a horse run, if you will require that it always swim, it's never going to be a happy horse. Horses want to run. I mean, they want to go. And it's like this is Aristotle's thing about you got to work out what the essence of the thing is and what it wants to do, and then create the conditions or allow it to find the conditions that allow it to express that inner drive. So this is all over what he's talking about here. I'm glad you pointed it out. The human condition. I mean, when I asked him a week and a half ago, where did he get these ideas? He did say, yeah, the human condition was a pivotal work, but by no means was it the only one. But I think, Donald, you're right. Any of us can read the human condition, and we read that section on education. It's clear that there is a strong relationship between what Arendt's talking about there and what Smith's talking about here. They're clearly working the same material, just with
And there's also a touch of Phil's Heidegger being thrown into the world.
Yes. Yeah.
That I think is good. That if you throw people into the world,
yeah,
you are now responsible for these progressions for them. You have to introduce them to it. I kind of like that. That's a tie-in. That's something I don't ever hear Kenneth talk. I don't remember hearing Kenneth talk about that.
He doesn't talk about Heidegger a lot.
No, there was a Heideggerian at LSU, but I don't think he wasn't like buddies with. I can't imagine them being buddies. Maybe they were, but
I think rather not.
Anyway, yeah. But how education, Arendt associates that with throwing into the world. It's done by other people. Your parents throw you into this world.
Yes.
And now that's where their obligations come from.
Right.
From their act of throwing.
Logical consequences. So, the only Heidegger that I've read is his book on Heraclitus, and I really need to read his more central works, which we've talked about in these seminars before. It's on my to-do list, but this year I'm really trying to catch up on scholarship, early 20th century scholarship into the Greeks.
Well, I think I probably have a unused copy of Being in Time in German. That was given to me by someone else, equally unperused.
I would love it.
What?
Hey, Donald, was that given to you or thrown at you?
It was actually it was given to me. But
Heidegger books can only be thrown into the collection.
I don't know. I've read some Heidegger, but not Being in Time in its entirety, just in excerpts.
Yeah.
But the books that I like are the little, like there's Heidegger, Die Frage nach dem Ding, Was heißt Denken, the What is called thinking. These are little thin essays.
Yeah.
That are approachable to me. I mean, or I can approve, but.
So how's your German?
It's not it's not good enough to read it anymore. I'll tell you that. I could at one time, but it just goes away. I know that was one of the last things I think I ever talked about with Kenneth was, can you still read German or Greek? And it's like, you know, gets tired. It just goes,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
Well, unless you use it or lose it, right? It's like any other skill.
Yeah, and I didn't pursue philosophy continually in a way, but you know, I don't know if that's a big hill, but I think it's a hill that you have to try and climb. Is if you really want to read the Greeks, you got to try and read the Greeks.
Yeah, in their own words.
In their own words. On
Yeah.
how.
Well, I mean, the German's even worse, right? I mean, you've heard me whine a number of times about Hegel and the phenomenology and how bad the translations are. They're just awful. Just awful.
Yeah, we read some Kafka in German, but not serious philosophical works. No, I won't claim that. I read reference materials. I looked up Greeks in German encyclopedias. That was one of my jobs. Not anymore.
The word begriff.
Yeah.
Griff.
I suddenly noticed how curiously it reminded me of an experience I had when I was probably about 2 or 3 years old, that my mother was probably trying to teach me words, and, probably point at my dad and say, father. And I'd look at this picture and my dad would be there, and there'd be things on the wall and there'd be objects around. I was trying to figure out, is she talking about him or one of these other objects?
That's right.
And then one day when I was, had finished with the other stages, crawling and done all the stuff that you could do with walking, I was running out of ideas. I thought, better learn some words. Suddenly out of the ether, up there, and I grabbed it, begriff.
Yeah, grasp.
Was the word that.
Mm-hmm.
I suddenly woke up that there was a word that, and I could apply it to any object. So I went to my mother and I pointed at it, that, I'd point at it. That, what's the name? I meant.
Mm-hmm.
What is the name of that? But I only had the word that.
You worked out everything had names.
Yeah, and she looked at me and she seemed to think that I wanted the object rather than the name. And she kept on trying to pick up the object and give it to me. That. The only word I really understood, as a general concept, the word that.
Yes.
And so I was looking at the word begriff. I realized to grab. That's literally how it almost felt.
Yes.
Out of the clouds. Ah, yes, that.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, for Sharon's benefit, what he's alluding to is that the definition of begriff, even though we use it in this class in a philosophical way to mean that concrete knowledge that comes from direct experience, the roots of the word in German go back to the verb to grasp. And so you'll see it translated as to recognize, to grasp, there's a whole range of things. And when you look at that range, at first it strikes you as odd until you realize that in English, to say I grasp the hammer and I grasp the idea are both legitimate uses of grasp in English as well. This is one of those places where German and English still preserve the same kind of range of uses of the words, even though the spelling and pronunciation has drifted apart. So begriff has this sense of your direct interaction with the world and putting your hands on things. Well, let's dive into this. Let's get into the text. So last week we got 2 sentences into this. And as you recall, this paragraph is following the previous one where they talked about the physics and how things separate according to density. into the solid, the liquid, the gaseous, and the energetic or plasma, and that they express this in terms of earth, water, air, and fire, but really we would read these as the phases of matter. Even we wouldn't call them elements, we'd call them phases of matter. But we're still talking about the same thing. The fact that they've got elements and phases conflated, that's just because, they don't have microscopes. They don't have, they're missing the apparatus that would be required to distinguish them. But they're generally right that in the cosmos, even though everything is thrown together into these mixtures, nevertheless, we can identify quite discrete boundaries between categories of things where it's not us making it up. It's just obviously apparent that the rock and the water running over the rock have very different behaviors. So from this, they're generalizing this idea of what is the character of the matter under consideration, the hyle, Hyle. So, the character of stone is different from the character of water. And from this, they got this generalized idea of character as being the intrinsic, essential part of a thing that defines many of its behaviors or characteristics or properties. And so, armed with that kind of conception of the world, they look at people and they say, well, it must be the same must be true of people as well. There must be people of different characters. And those characters must explain why people behave differently when you put them into the same situation, that they have a different character, a different nature within them. Cornford confirms that if you survey all of the available ancient Greek literature, you can see that they're using the word physis or nature not only in the sense of the cosmos as a whole and its flowing and becoming and so forth, but they do also use it at times synonymously to mean character. They use it as a synonym for ethos sometimes, just like we do in English. Nature as a whole versus what is your nature? What is the nature of a stone? The Greeks are using the same thing. And that sort of implies, considering how early the Germanic languages and the Hellenic languages split from each other, it sort of implies that might go all the way back to Proto-Indo-European, that this is just this kind of use of nature to mean both things is very, very old in these cultures. And from this, you can see why Heraclitus would derive this concept of the two natures, the nature around us and the nature within us, because that's coming right out of the language. The Greeks were heavily influenced by the definitions and grammar of their own language. So I'm going to reread these two, but then we're going to move on to the third sentence. This is really I want to get past where we were last week. Greek society was also articulated into such a natural hierarchy. That is, Greek society's class strata were castes or a system of rank grounded in the natural character of each individual's personality type. So, we see nature in this sense, and we should be hearing in our, if we're thinking like Kenneth Smith, we should be hearing in our ears the echo kata phusei, according to nature, the ultimate way of resolving an argument. What is the essential nature of the thing itself? Let persuasiveness and rhetoric and logic, let all those things be secondary considerations, right? To the Greeks, if it's coming out of somebody's mouth, it's a secondary consideration to the question of what is its essential nature, because nature ranks above man in the hierarchy of meanings. So they didn't want to own slaves just because they were brutes who could enforce their will upon other people and make them be slaves. They didn't want that. They wanted to have slaves if it was that they had a differential nature from the people that they were enslaving, and that justified, or more than justified, that meant that the different people in question, if you left them alone to their own devices, they would naturally have focused on those activities anyway, whereas we would naturally focus on a different activity. That's what they wanted their class division to be. Now, of course, we're going to refer back to Heidegger and being thrown into the world, which I see as an extrapolation of the tragic concept of in media res. The Greeks are approaching these ideas and theorizing in media res. There have already been Hellenic and pre-Hellenic societies engaged in slavery for over 1,000 years by the time these people are theorizing and trying to make up reasons why their current status quo is justified. So, they're sort of caught on the horns of a dilemma. To what extent do you really want to describe the nature of human beings and their differential characters? And to what extent do you want to avoid rocking the boat so badly that you threaten the foundations of society and incite revolutions and have your slaves murder you all? So they're really walking a fine line here, and as they're philosophizing and trying to come up with these distinctions. But they took this stuff seriously. The book that I pointed you guys at last week, Images of the Slave, how the Greeks conceived of slaves and slavery. I still have to finish that book. I'm really enjoying it. It really explores Greek attitudes, not just towards slaves, but towards non-Greeks in general. What did the Greeks think non-Greek peoples were like? And when you read it, you're struck by speculation about other people that has that same character-based focus as these rationalizations of slavery. That is to say, regardless of whether they're accurately depicting what other cultures are like, they're trying to depict them according to what they think their essential character is. So the other book says, for example, that the Greeks tended to think that people from the north have courage but not intelligence. And for all white people, they're talking about us, right? That's our ancestors, all those Germanic peoples up there. They have no lack of courage. They're perfectly willing to die in a fight. The Greeks admired that because they themselves considered themselves willing to die in a fight, and they thought that was part of their virtue. But they didn't think they were that bright, and they called them barbarians in this case because they were, you remember this bit. Barbarian doesn't just mean anybody who's not Greek; it means anybody who doesn't speak Greek. And that people who speak Greek, if they master the language, that's evidence, and especially if they also take on the religion and the laws, it's evidence that they have lifted themselves up to being, a higher status than before they spoke Greek. They really thought their language was the cat's meow. So those people in the north, they didn't have Greek. They couldn't speak Greek. They're idiots, right? They're when they open their mouths, all that comes out is bar, bar, bar. There's like roaring like lions, that they're posturing. It's like what Shakespeare says when he says, "A tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." The Greeks, when Shakespeare writes that, he's evoking the Hellenic ethos of the purpose of language and art, which is to illuminate the essential natures of things. And if you're not doing that, if you're just passing the time or making a quick buck or entertaining people, it's just gibberish and you're an idiot. What makes you an idiot is that you're so wrapped up in yourself that you can't look at other things and see into their essential nature and accurately depict it. Because that's a sign of barbarism. That's a sign of being an idiot. And that's what they thought all the people from the north were. So they said people from the north would only make a certain kind of slave, right? Maybe they would be useful in fighting or something. It's hard to say, but you wouldn't, there are a lot of things you couldn't do with them. They thought people from the south, by contrast, the warmer climes, not the colder climes, they thought that they were much smarter. They could learn all kinds of things, and that you could learn an enormous amount from Egyptians and Persians and so forth. But that they lacked courage. They weren't willing to die. They were afraid to die. And so you could enslave them because, if it's like be a slave or die, they'd say, okay, I'll be a slave. Whereas they try to enslave the Germans up north and they're like, I don't know, they sort of choose death a lot, like we would. And so, they saw different virtues in both groups and different vices in both groups. And the Greeks defined themselves as the people who have both intelligence and courage. That's who we are. Now, there's bigotry in all this, of course, but it's a very curious form of bigotry. It's not a generalized everybody else is bad and we suck. It's a bigotry that's trying to say, what is the natures of peoples? What is the natures of cultures? What's their constitution and disposition? It has nothing to do with race, right? I mean, they're talking entirely, they may use the phrase race, but they don't mean it the way a modern does it. They're talking about, what character types are we seeing in the world? And character types of cultures and the kinds of people that they're capable of producing. And they fully recognized that even in the North, among the courageous idiots, you could occasionally get a courageous smart person, or you could get a cowardly idiot. That there was variation. They knew there was variation as well. And the same is true of people from the South. that among these smart cowards that they imagined to live there, that you could get the occasional smart, courageous person, who might rise to the level of an Aristos, or you might get, a stupid coward, might be among the things that the Southern people could produce as well. There was variation, but what they saw is they considered themselves to have, because of their language and their culture and so forth, and because of the essential disposition of that culture, they thought that the Hellenic cultures had a higher than average chance of producing people who had both courage and intelligence, which were necessary, they considered, to be an Aristos, to rise to the level of the Greeks. So all of this is bound up in what he's talking about here in this first sentence. And I didn't cover that very well last week. I wanted to bring that in. So Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, obviously there's bias, but that's not the point I want to get to. I wonder to what degree the metaphor and the four elements, obviously they're not the elements now, but okay, the metaphor, the four elements makes sense. To what degree that metaphor itself is a faulty translation into human character? Because two things, it seems like the first thing is, when I was in high school, I think it was in high school, I remember, I guess, talking to my physics teacher or something. And we talked, somehow we began talking about glass. And I was actually very surprised when he said, glass is not a solid, it's a super cool liquid. And I'm like, okay, all right, like, that just struck me like, that's weird, like, but on the other hand, when you now have contemporary astronomy and they go to, let's say the moon, is it Europa or, or Titan, that there's liquid methane. So to what degree are these four elements themselves unstable in the sense, depending on the situation? So it's like, well, in Greece, so obviously there are four elements. Okay, I'll buy that. But what happens when you go somewhere else? And then to have that and then translate it metaphorically into the character of human beings, that might be another fallacy besides restricting the elements to a particular site and time and place.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, there seems to be a lot of slipperage, depending on the context. So the context, you go to Titan and everything is different, raining methane and all that kind of stuff. Perhaps you go to, I guess that would be Venus, that would be raining lead, something of that sort. I mean, so in some sense, like there's a problem there. Now, I happen to like metaphor, but you have to understand that the metaphors may not have the kind of precision about talking about things, but it does have a very interesting sort of cloud of meanings in some sense, and that's important. So I wonder whether they took that metaphor into a degree of concreteness that was, in some sense, a fallacy. So that's a question I want to ask.
Oh yeah.
Is glass a super cool liquid? I was surprised by that at that time, but now
Yeah,
I
and it's your question's right on the money. I mean, I took a lot of science classes in high school, and I loved science from since I was a little kid, and when I got older, I just kept collecting science books, and I've got bookcases full of stuff downstairs. I adore it. And phase changes in matter is one of my favorite areas. I'm really interested in how many more phases of matter have been discovered since the classic four. I mean, there've been a lot more, but they all occur under very unusual circumstances. I mean, there's a few exceptions like gelatins, like Jello. You know, we're all familiar with Jello. That's an alternative phase of matter. That's neither solid nor liquid, but something else that's interesting. And there are some others that we experience in our lives, but don't know to pick out as a unique form. But the basic four hold up very well. And the general rule of thumb is that in materials science, well, if we put it generally, any given substance, unless it has some special qualities, can move between all of these phases of matter. You know, if you lower the heat and or increase the pressure on something, it'll move towards being a solid. And if you lower the pressure and or increase the heat, it'll move towards, you know, becoming a gas, or eventually, you know, if under the right circumstances, you can turn it into a plasma, or even into energy, thus E equals mc squared. But with every kind of matter, and this is something the Greeks didn't fully appreciate, with every different kind of matter, exactly where are those boundaries with temperature and pressure and other things that make something undergo a phase change? They're different for everyone. You can draw it out on a two-dimensional grid, you know, where you've got pressure going one way and temperature going another, and you can draw the lines for where does it move from, you know, solid to liquid or from liquid to gas, and those lines will be in a different place than they would be for any other substance. It's essential to the matter itself, kind of what it does. And some of them will skip a phase. Some of them are very hard to get into one phase. They kind of want to jump directly from one phase to one that seems to be two away. And it's very hard to get them to go into the one that's in the middle. So there's a variety of things here, but the general idea here is that the Greeks are right. These things do have different characteristic behaviors. And when we say that, we also mean that first of all, that the transitions are also characteristic of that specific matter. It's essential to the matter, you know. It doesn't matter where you get your lead from, you know. It's as long as it's lead, it's going to behave the same way. It really does have this essential nature. That's at the core of its character. We don't, in modern science, like to use these words. We think these words are, you know, wishy-washy, but there's nothing wrong with them. The Greeks have words to specifically describe this idea that there is a profile for how lead behaves under temperature and pressure that's characteristic of lead, and only of lead, and no other element in the world will have exactly that same profile of transformations and phase states. It's really interesting stuff. So on the one hand, there's that there is a grounded reality to this, and it reinforces the notion of essence and character and haliosis and all these other things. On the other hand, you're absolutely right as well about the dangers of reasoning by metaphor, which is all they could do. I mean, they didn't have microscopes, they didn't have vacuum chambers, they didn't have pressure chambers. You know, they did have metallurgists, in the sense that forging was incredibly important to them. I mean, the Iron Age really led to the rise of the classical Greeks. That's how they were able to conquer their way into the peninsula. But so they revered those people. But the blacksmiths themselves had their own conceptual framework to try to understand what they were doing and what it meant and why it worked. And it might have been the ancestor of materials science and chemistry and physics, but it wasn't. We can't mistake it at all for being the same thing. And you can be sure that it was heavily laden with kind of philosophy and religion. It was drawing out of this really archaic vein of interpretation. I mean, that's what Cornford gets at in his book that I just put, the first book, From Religion to Philosophy, the one he wrote when he was younger. That's what he gets at in there, is the direct relationship between anthropology. The anthropological studies of the origins of religion tell us an enormous amount about why these philosophers propose the things that they do. That the scientific hypothesis, the attempt to describe philosophers as rudimentary scientists that we do today when we look back, it just basically doesn't hold water at all. They didn't start by exploring the world and then going, I think everything's composed of atoms. They started with their religion, which they then tried to justify and reason about, and they ran into contradictions. And their attempts to resolve those contradictions required them to postulate atoms as the solution to the problem. And so that's how they ended up with atoms, as he points out very well in here. And many of the peculiar qualities of the atoms that they very clearly describe, but that we sort of skim past because that sounds like gibberish to us. It's not gibberish at all. It makes perfect sense within their religious framework. And they needed that to be a quality of atoms in order for atoms to solve the problem that they had, cosmologically and theologically. So yeah, reasoning by metaphor, it's like half-witted genius. You're going to arrive at some amazing ideas before your time, and you're also going to arrive at a whole bunch of just complete garbage that seems equally plausible to you because you got there the same way, right? It's all ungrounded from gnosis. It's noesis reaching out, So great points, Phil. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I suppose one of the problems we use the word slave, and the meaning varied a lot in ancient times. A slave could be a servant, or we see in various phases of Greco-Roman society where slaves became the notorious chattel, virtually property. Reading through ancient stories and that, you read about the Vikings, and you get these ideas about how they lived their life. And so you had a guy that virtually owned the ranch. He was a master, and he would confer on his immediate family, the equality that comes with being a member of the family, but they would have their ranch hands who were servants. In some cases, they might be actual slaves, but in other cases, the ranch hands had the right once a year to go and seek another master. So essentially free. But it seems the nature of that society was there just wasn't much opportunity. If you're unskilled, if you didn't own anything, your only opportunity was to work for somebody else for a living. And that meant essentially being paid in getting to eat. And occasionally you'd be rewarded and given something. Now, you look at the Viking slaves, curiously, had the right to own property. So if they were given a gift, given a reward, that was regarded as their property. But we have, stories of where the Romans created those massive and very profitable agricultural farms, where, of course, the labourers were slaves, which had been captured and whatever had been sold off to these masters, and they were used literally as farm machinery. They were kept in virtual prison at night time. So here we're striking the other extreme of chattel slavery. So we have one type of service where basically you're just working for somebody and you're expected to obey your master. But it's not quite the same thing of a person that's been locked up as a virtual chattel. And these are two sort of very differing situations. And so I just don't know. So what sort of reference have you found in this ancient book to those two extremes? Now, apparently the Vikings had a law that you could be taken as a slave and your service was property, but only for a certain amount of time. After so many years, you've got your freedom. And of course, the glorious freedom was simply you could go and look for another master if you weren't happy with the one you had. You didn't own anything, you didn't have the skills. One of the things when you read these ancient sources is it's not just owning stuff. The guy who owned stuff had to have the smarts to run his farm very well. If you didn't, you're on your way to ruin. it was very easy to be ruined. And so this was a life that was struggle. It's not the case where you could just wander off and set up on your own, which was the case in early America, where the people they took as servants had the right to their freedom after, what was it, about so many years, 7 years or 10 years. And of course, being on the edge of colonial society, they could just go and grab a piece of land and set up on their own. They've acquired the skills how to farm.
Right.
And and then they didn't like that. So they introduced chattel slavery, which wasn't really within English law or English custom.
Yeah.
You had indentured servitude where virtually you had a contract for 7 years or whatever it was.
Yes.
But you weren't a piece of property. Eventually you were free of your contract, free to go somewhere else if you wanted to. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, this is what we're going to run into in this, is that in English, we've got this one word slave, and then we don't have any other words. You know, we talk about slavery versus indentured servitude versus freedom as though they're three completely unrelated things, and as though each thing is coherent in itself. But we use the word slave to describe an enormous number of completely different things that the Greeks had different words for, and they would have been appalled that we would lump them together and treat them as the same kind of thing. And a classic example, which I first misspelled here, so we'll have to ignore that. Let me see. I can't delete that. Oh, I can delete that. I'll just delete that out of the chat. There, that's better. So doulos is someone who has the character of a slave. It means slave, but it specifically implies not just a slave, but a slavish person. And so they would frequently use the word doulos for people who were free, but who had slavish character and slavish mentality. And it's because of that usage. The book that I pointed you at, the Reconstructing the Slave, author Renhaven expresses a certain amount of puzzlement at the flexibility of the term. You know, why are some people called douloi who are not slaves? But, you know, clearly the reason, when you see it coming out of Hannah Arendt and Kenneth Smith and so on, is that the Greeks had a word specifically for the slavish character. That's a doulos, is a slavish character, regardless of the caste position. Whereas andropodon, which I misspelled previously, andropodon, is someone who was captured in war or kidnapped. And there were slave takers who ran around following the armies, you know, enslaving whoever they could get their hands on. And sometimes those people worked for the conquerors, and the conquerors would, you know, conquer the city. And during the loot and pillage phase that followed, they would be claiming households and saying, okay, the people in this household are mine. And maybe they'd get the aid of a slave taker to, you know, round them up and put them in chains and drag them off afterwards. But the problem was that those slave takers would frequently act on their own. And so, you know, they might kidnap you as you're walking down the road between, you know, from your polis to the neighboring polis. And next thing you know, you're a slave. And this horrified the Greeks. They hated it. And they hated those slave takers. I mean, they talked about them a lot as just despicable human beings who were not willing to distinguish the character of the person in deciding who they were going to kidnap. They just grabbed whoever was vulnerable. And so I've been talking for a year or two about this idea that the Greek character system that talks about douloi, banausoi, and aristoi arose as a rationalization of their caste system that they inherited. But it's more than that. It's the active living presence of these slave takers enslaving people that the Greeks thought should be free, led them to really make a strong distinction between who should or shouldn't be a slave. They really didn't want it to be the case that once you were thrown into the caste, you were now treated that way forever. They wanted people who had been unjustly enslaved to be able to escape that status, because it was happening to people they cared about. You know, there's a lot of things that people will put up with as long as it never happens to them. It only happens to other people. Even more so if it always happens out of sight where they never have to look at it or think about it. But when it comes home and starts hitting your own family and friends, then people suddenly start getting a lot more morally outraged and they become a lot more interested in justice. And so this is heavily involved here in these different terms that they're making. And it goes strongly into the distinctions that the Greeks are trying to make. It really matters to them who should or shouldn't be treated like a slave. It's really important from a Greek perspective. And then this book is also, I'm not done with it yet. I'm only about halfway through. It's also exploring this idea that the Greeks had contempt for traders and people who worked in the marketplace, craftsmen and so forth. Even though they're no longer just doing manual labor on the oikos, on the household, even though they're out in society, the free Greeks still have contempt for them. And the author Renhaven again expresses some confusion about that. So what's going on here? But you know what we know from Arendt and Aristotle and others is that those people weren't free either. Those people weren't free either. They didn't have the vote either. They were free from the confines because they were considered to have transcended mere animal appetite, which was considered the level of the doulos. They could rise to the level of training themselves, learning things, working within a craft, you know, recognizing differences in expertise and voluntarily submitting to the authority of someone who knows more than they do in their chosen trade. You know, they could organize themselves into hierarchies and into systems of learning. And for that reason, they were considered, you know, to be half free people. You know, they were able to master themselves to a certain extent, but they were not considered to be able to master themselves when it came to questioning their own ideologies, questioning their own training, questioning, you know, the things that make sense to them. That they were still likely to run afoul. A trader was likely to run afoul of forgetting that the purpose of trade is friendship. That they might start thinking, I really should just screw my neighbor as much as I can, you know, because the numbers say so. That's, you know, the numbers have no morality to them. And the Greeks thought that was horrifying as well. So they called those people banausoi. And I'm looking forward to seeing the part of this book that gets more into the terms that were used. I'm betting there's a variety of terms that are used there. But I haven't got that far into it. I mean, I want to collect this stuff and look at it. So, but all the things you're talking about, Stephen, it's explored in this book, and the book doesn't stand entirely on its own, although it's very useful. But if you supplement it with The Human Condition by Hannah Arendt, together they make a really interesting kind of commentary on each other. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay. The first sentence. Greek society was also articulated into such a natural hierarchy that its class strata were castes. I find the interchangeability of class strata and castes among the Greek very interesting, because you can move around within a class. But in today's world, when you're in a caste, it's something fixed. Like in the Indian society, you know, the Brahmins to the untouchables, right? Or a system of rank grounded in the natural character of each individual's personality type. Today, the caste system we have doesn't have anything to do with personality type. And so,
just money.
The caste system, I think, has to do with what society makes it, right? I think in America, Black people are part of a caste.
Right.
You know, that's the natural perception, I think.
Yeah.
And so from where this started, the interchangeability of these two terms,
yes,
for the Greeks and for the moderns, are two very, very different things.
Yes.
In fact, I'm reading a book now called Castes, The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson. She was the first Black woman to win a Pulitzer Prize for journalism. And she made a movie called Origins, which probably will start streaming. But the postulate in that book is that there are three societies, started with the Greeks, and which is why I find this definition so interesting: the American system, the Nazis, and the Indians. And there was where you had a society which revolved around castes.
Right.
And that's why I find the interchangeability of those two words
Yes.
from the early Greeks very interesting.
Yes. Yeah, it's this particular use of juxtaposing class and caste, I think is let's spend this is an important point you're raising. Let's spend a little time on this. First of all, this is Kenneth put juxtaposing them rather than the Greeks per se.
Oh,
But
okay.
but your question is still right, because the Greeks would have juxtaposed them. I mean, at the time the classical Greeks are writing, they may have known vaguely of India, but mainly they knew about Persia. And Persia sort of was a wall that didn't allow them to know much about India beyond it. They were very distracted by Persia, because Persia invaded, not that long before, invaded Greece. So it's not until long after this, under Alexander the Great, that the Greeks have any firsthand exposure to Indian society. They don't know about those kind of rigid caste systems quite as clearly. They certainly see some rigidity in other cultures. Maybe in Persia they see some rigidity, but nothing like what they will later see when Alexander takes his army to the boundaries of India. And then they're going to really learn some things about caste. But even if they had known, they still would have asked the same questions. It's in their nature as Greeks to be very concerned about injustice in the assignment of people to classes. And the only way to repair that injustice is to allow for mobility. You have to allow mistakes to be corrected, because otherwise you're perpetuating an unjust society. That is, to put it in selfish terms, if a Greek found their own family member had been enslaved, they needed the ability to justify getting that person freed. Say some idiot slave taker has stolen my family member. Here they are being treated as a slave. I'm a free person. They were a free person. You have to free them. They needed the class system to work that way because of the chaos that was going on. And if you look back at the chaos, you can imagine that a fair amount of it rose during that dark age of illiteracy and breakdown of law that preceded the classical Greek era. That's from all of the fragments that we have, that was an era of extreme lawlessness. There's a lot of banditry. There was a lot of piracy. There would have been a lot of slave takers running around kidnapping people and making slaves out of them. And so, the rise of classical Greece rising out of that dark era is not just about, let's get everybody reading and writing, let's get everybody, sharing the Olympian religion, let's get everybody respecting the Olympian Games and so forth. It's also got to be a rise in justice. We got to go beyond an eye for an eye and start getting towards, what is right and wrong, and how do we realign the laws of the polis to defend us, to try to give us ways to remedy injustices. So rigid caste systems, like they were later going to run into India, they would not have cared for at all. They needed the ability for people to rise and fall within the classes, or else they couldn't fix what had gone wrong, what had already gone wrong before they started writing, I guess is what I need to say.
So caste here the word here has a totally different meaning from the moderns then.
Yes, certainly. The modern definition of the term caste is tricky, because in the modern world, we sort of don't believe, we believe that we're a classless society and we're all free, right? That's what we believe. We think
That's an illusion.
That's right. But that's when people go to give political speeches to get elected, they don't say, I will restore our beautiful caste system. They always say, I will help us all be free. Vote for me and you'll be free. We believe in this idea that, we're a classless society, and we try not to think about the differences between billionaires and, people on welfare. We try to pretend that's not a thing. So, it's, on the one hand, it's tricky, the use of the word caste, because to us, it means something entirely different. But if we allow caste to have a meaning, we assume it means something very much like India, very rigid, very hierarchical, all the way from Brahmins down to untouchables. The use of the word caste and class within the same sentence is partly trying to reflect the fact that the Greek city-states were considered each to be self-contained and able to run their own political science experiments. And so there was an enormous amount of diversity between different polis, between Athens and Sparta, sure, but also Corinth or Thebes or any other city-state. They might have a completely different constitution and government. And some of them could be more rigid than others. Some of them were more fluid, and some of them were more rigid. So he's using the term here in a relative sense, that the ones that were more rigid tended to be the butt of criticism on grounds that they had no remedy for people being involuntarily made andropodon when they should have been free. Whereas the more fluid ones, were supposedly did a better job of allowing people to escape an unjust assignment of class. So that's where he's using the term here. It's not in the full rigid sense of India, but in the relative sense of how one city-state differs from another.
Okay.
It's a great question. And it strikes right to the heart of this for the Greeks. What does it mean to be a slave? Well, they had a lot of different categories for what it meant to be a slave, and some of them were just and others were unjust. They thought some things should be abolished and other things they thought should be perpetuated. And the thing that they most wanted to perpetuate, the thing that they found that they had the easiest time justifying, is people should rise or fall to the class that naturally expresses who they are, and therefore is made up of the activities they would have done anyway left to their own devices. And that the more society mimics that, the more a just class system it is. And the more it deviates from that and puts people into classes that defy their inner character, then the more unjust a society that is.
Yeah, because the Greeks emphasize the substance of your being.
Yes.
Quite a bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And that seemed to fall more into the class structure, the character and the class structure rather than the caste.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So the contrast you're making between class and caste is a very useful one. And contrasting the ancient and the modern here is also incredibly useful, because the modern idealizes the idea of a classless society and says we're all equal and therefore there shouldn't be any classes. And the Greeks thought that was every bit as unjust as a rigid caste system. Because they said there are people you should never elect to high office because they're just walking appetites. If you put them in charge, they're just going to con everybody. So don't do it. Right? Don't give them that opportunity and then bemoan afterwards. Oh my God, how did this happen? Well, it happened because you don't have a class system. Right? You said it's fine if predators are allowed to prey upon people. You said that's great. Who are we to judge? If a psychopath wants to eat my daughter, why should I complain? Everybody's equal. And the Greeks are like, you people are insane. You have to distinguish people according to their character and allow them the level of freedom that allows them to fully express their inner gifts without becoming a curse to everybody around them. This is kind of the heart of the ancient proposition about how a society should be organized. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Whether it's right or wrong is a whole other issue, but this is what they thought.
Well, I just wanted to, there seemed to be a conflict to me, because we keep on we talk about the moderns a lot when we read early Greeks.
Yeah.
And this sets us up for a huge conflict right here.
It sure does. Yeah, this book has got huge conflicts coming.
Yeah.
Before we get to the one that's really about ancient versus modern, when we wrap up chapter 4 and move on to chapter 5, we're going to start into ancient versus medieval, which is a whole other thing, right? So that's where we're really going to be getting into issues of what did Jesus say versus what did the medieval church say, and how far apart are they, and what are the consequences, and how far apart are both of those things from the ancient worldview. This whole book is full of conflict for sure. Great questions, Sharon. Thank you.
Okay, welcome.
Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, my question is somewhat related to what Sharon said, but it takes it in a different direction. I mean, it seemed to me if the Greeks were trying to talk about the inner character of a human being, or the character of nature in a sense, then to what degree, particularly, are human beings in the class structure or even the caste structure is mediated by the social structure, and to what degree it's also mediated, perhaps even in a deeper fashion, by the linguistic structure. And it seems to me, once you have defined, let's say Black people or whatever, as a certain category structure, that has a lot of bearing on your concept of what things are. And to the degree that, in a sense, so now before I talked about the problem of poetic or metaphoric language as being a little too cloudy to be precise, but it also has a lot of fluidity, allow for change and things. And it seems to me at the time we're talking about, the Greek culture was evolving from essentially a metaphorical or mythic language to a more technical language that's more suited for categories and structures that could delineate something. And I wonder to what degree, if that hadn't left a burden on all of the Indo-European cultures, because we believe the language is so potent and so real that we forget about the reality that's beneath the language. So in some sense, we're fighting this struggle because on the one hand, we want to be fair to everybody. But on the other hand, the language sort of like limits the boundaries. The boundary becomes harder and harder, and class may become a caste in actuality. So, yeah, I mean, I was going to approach this, and I decided not to approach this. That it's interesting that Sharon brought up the Greeks, essentially the Europeans, and the Americans, the Europeans, and then the Indians. They were all Aryans in some sense, right? Is there something particular about Aryans? Because now the Indians that are not Aryans are Dravidians. They're different. But the Aryans essentially dominated the culture of Indian thought, which is essentially bound in that same language to a certain degree. I mean, yeah, it's diffused now, but still, there might have been a root structure in that
There
system.
definitely was.
So I wonder to what degree, I mean, like, I remember talking to, that was almost 20 years ago, 15 years ago or something. I was in Europe. I was happened to traveling on a train to Prague. I met this girl she's an Iranian, but she was a long distance runner. And, and I told her, like, well, I didn't mention that she was an Aryan, but I told her that that she was a marathon runner. I said, if I was you, I would refuse to run the marathon. I would restrict myself to 10,000 meters. And she was surprised by my statement. I said, do you know what the origin of the marathon is? Have you wondered why it's 26 miles and 216 yards? I mean, like, that's a weird spot to end the marathon. I mean, like, why is that so?
Right.
And I explained that was exactly the distance between marathon and Athens. And so she was surprised. I don't know whether she changed her mind and decided to refuse to, run against, because they were celebrating the defeat of the Persians. So that was interesting. So yeah, I was just wondering, like, yeah, we are so bound by, in fact, like a lot of contemporary philosophy, and I'm glad to sort of downplay that to a certain degree, They always start with define your terms. What? That's how we're going to structure this argument. Yeah. All you artists could just leave the room because
Yes.
you really can't quite define your terms, right? So, yeah, I think that we have to begin to inspect the way our language is used, because that's at the bottom of the structure
It is.
that rules us. So I
Yeah.
just thought I would add that to what Sharon is saying.
Oh, I'm glad you did. It's easy to forget that the caste system in India was set up by the invading Aryans, and the Aryans are Indo-Europeans, just like the people who went into Europe. I mean, it's the same group of people north of the Caucasus Mountains between the Caspian and Black Seas that split off both directions. They also went south into the Middle East and into Turkey, but they split off in those three directions. And when we talk about the idea that they're linked into a Proto-Indo-European language and culture, I mean, it's not a hypothesis. You can easily see countless term after term after term after term that obviously is related to each other. And once you start seeing all those terms, you can do the exact same thing with the religions. You can compare the Olympian religion to the early Vedic religion in India, and deity after deity after deity, has corresponding attributes. I mean, they really did spread. And you can do the same thing between the Germanic and the Greeks. As the Greeks later discovered and were very fascinated by, you can line up the Germanic deities with the Greek deities. And even though they've drifted a ways from, they've got slightly different characters and qualities, their overall domains of nature that they're in charge of are the exact same ones. And frequently there are very similar personalities ascribed to them. So the rigidity of the caste system in India is one of the possible ways of expressing the same cultural impulse that led to creating the kind of freer, more fluid class system of Greece, or even the sort of supposedly freedom-loving system of the North. The Germans were famously described by the Romans, especially Tacitus and Caesar, Julius Caesar, as being, much less interested in rigid class societies, much more interested in parliaments and open discussions, and more rights for women than Rome or Greece were used to, and things like that. But that was a potential line of development from the Proto-Indo-European Yamnaya people. It's just the other major developments didn't go that direction. But even then, you can still trace the deities back and look at correlations between Odin and this Greek deity or that Hindu deity. They're all a big family. One of the things that Cornford talks about in his earlier book, From Religion to Philosophy, is the relationship between the Greek concept of Dike, Dike, the goddess of justice, if you will. But that before the goddess of justice, there was an older concept of Dike, which was very much like the Tao, or like Dharma, or like the Hindu concept of Rta. It was this concept that the way that the cosmos works is not an accident, and that it needs to work that way, and that it makes possible all the things that we value, that there is a logic, not just a logic to nature, but a justice to nature that has allowed the production of us, our languages, our cultures, the food we eat, everything that we care about, is produced by this current of justice. And that, you flout that current at your peril. And as Cornford points out, the Greeks had a whole concept in which necessity and fate and character and all these things were bound together into this really coherent description, not only of how nature works, but of human society. And he talks about why. Why would they both follow the same pattern? It's really interesting reading. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, yeah, for this class system, it seemed to be very important in this older world prior to what we had as general education. You get that impression from, say, British society. You watch something like Upstairs, Downstairs, and until quite recently, the British had a fairly rigid concept of class. You were born to a certain class, you were brought up in a certain way, you were expected to live in a certain role. Now, with money, you could jump that role, but when I was reading about, say, the ancient Dark Age of society, one thing that comes up was with common men, they particularly divided them into two types, the authorities. And there were thanes and the lesser common men. Now, the thanes were at the top of common society. And I don't know whether you applied to be a thane or you just got designated as a thane. If you owned a lot of property to a certain level, if you owned lands beyond the needs of just one family, to a certain extent, you might take in land that would serve about five families, you became a thane. If you owned a ship and you went overseas and you traded, you became a thane. Now, it seems to be that a thane was somebody who had proven that they could run things. They were running property. And either they're going to be successful or they're going to be failures. If they're failures, they're no good. But if they're successful, you must have something going for you. If you can own a ship and go overseas and trade and face all the dangers and come back, you must have some talent. And it seems to be that this minority of common men, who they called thanes, were regarded as the cream of society. And the rest, well, we could lose a few of them, but if you start losing your thanes, you could have problems.
That's right.
But there was something, of course, very different, very, very different from our modern society, that if you have wealth, in these ancient societies, if you were a thane, you not only had superior rights, you also had superior responsibilities.
Yes.
Superior rights walk hand in hand with superior responsibilities. So the thanes were responsible for making sure that their neck of the woods was functioning.
Right. Right.
If the thanes had to make sure that their village had a public hall, or their village had a church, or the roads were kept clear.
Right.
The bridges were kept in repair.
Yeah.
They were the ones that copped it. The king's men came along. What's this? This place is a mess. They were the ones that copped it.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you failing? Are you truly a thane? So this is something we've lost. The idea that older society, if you had position, if you had wealth, you also had the responsibility to lead society.
Right.
Thank
Right.
you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that's the period that you're describing in English history is probably the period of history I know better than any other. I know it a lot better than I know the Greeks. It's my, for the stupidest of reasons, it's because my Dungeons and Dragons role-playing campaign was set in England in the year 1000. So I have an entire bookcase full of works on Anglo-Saxon history and culture and civilization and so on. And, you know, I was trying to do a very historically grounded fantasy role-playing game. And my wife had a degree in history. So between the two of us, we really wanted to play in that kind of a world. But it, accidentally, as a side effect, I ended up learning all about Thanes and Oathweight and all of this stuff. And it's, everything you're saying is right. Everything you're saying is exactly on the money. List any, if anybody hasn't studied this period, what Stephen's saying is just right. And it's part of what we're going to find that's fascinating when we go into the next chapter. We start getting into the medieval period, is how the medieval period was about a rigidification or castification of the class system. That what Stephen's describing is the early period, which is carrying over momentum from the, I guess, the pre-ancient world, you know, the world that the Greeks and the Romans hadn't fully brought under their authority. And those in those societies, your class system for your society was a construct that you generated every moment of every day, and it had to be able to change in response to circumstances. So, you know, if you're a cowardly dick who's a jerk to everyone around them, then you would have your class stripped from you rapidly in these Germanic societies, because I mean, otherwise the society would collapse. They couldn't afford to have somebody in a position of power abusing things, because they were closer to the edge than the Greek and Roman societies were. They didn't have room to carry dead weight like that. So that's why those societies had various rites and rituals, like the ritual where I think I mentioned before, they would get all of the Thanes together in a hall with the king and make them all tell the stories of the great things that they'd done in the past to serve the people, and what promises were they willing to make for the future. And while they're and they would ply them with drink, a really strong honeymead alcohol that they didn't normally have access to, so that their inhibitions and cleverness were lowered, and they would just blurt out what it was in their character to say. And then there was a special officer who sat at the other end of the table called the Thula, and his whole job was to know the history in detail so that he could puncture the egos of the people who were bragging about things they did and say, that's, I was there on that day, and no, you did not dispatch 20 enemies. One guy cut your arm and you ran away. You're a coward. So, you know, the purpose of doing that was to shame these people in public, you know, in an unforgettable, unmistakable way, to take their power away from them so that they would fall in status and somebody else could rise to take their place, who was more responsible, who was more brave, who was more honest. And this was going on all the time. Like every year they'd have some celebration like this in which they're going through culling their Thanes and creating opportunities to promote new ones to take their place. They couldn't afford the kind of ossification we see in the Roman Empire, where, you know, I'm thinking of Commodus, right? Why has Commodus become emperor? Because he's the son of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, the amazing, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the great, but his son's an idiot and he's dangerous, but he's in charge anyway, because they've so ossified that merely being born the son was enough to give him all this power that by his essential character he didn't deserve. And he was a menace, right? So the Germans were better at pruning people like that than the Romans were, because the Romans had so much power at stake that the structures of society began to get ossified. People didn't want the boat shaken. It would shake up their concentrations of wealth. But the Germans didn't have that much wealth. It's like, there's the gold you're carrying on your body, there's the gold you leave in your hall, and that's it. That's all you've got. You don't have huge provinces like Germania, you know, that belong to you that you could mine for resources. So that's what you're saying, Stephen. This comes really close to the heart of, you know, how do different societies structure themselves. And it goes back to Sharon's question about which ones keep a fluidity and dynamism in their class structure versus which ones get locked in and then they get stuck because of that rigidity and they're unable to adapt. It goes back to Nora Bateson's term, symathesy. You're only alive if you stay in a perpetual learning relationship with your environment. When you stop learning, when it starts being the case that when conditions change, you don't change, and you just stay the way you were because your internal, class structures have created perverse incentives that don't allow you to adapt. That's when you start becoming less like an animal and more like a stone. You're less alive, and you're more likely to collapse because you're not going to respond correctly. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
The next two sentences in the paragraph, I don't know if they tend to contradict each other, but I think they impact the power levers in a society. Class and caste are the power levers in a society. And character seems to be a foundational basis, albeit kind of weak to me. But here is what Kenneth Smith said. He said, humans inherently tend to gravitate by their own free preference towards certain kinds of actions, work, concerns, and levels of competence and understanding, taking on responsibilities that feel right and shunning others. And the next sentence says, the Greeks looked a posteriori at the aggregate results of human preference and self-limitation and saw remarkable patterns of natural arete that ought to be respected and reinforced, but also hybridist or idiotist self-misevaluations needing to be held in check for the sake of higher structures of order. So they will only allow it so far.
Yes. Yes.
And then the levers of power become important in that society.
Yes.
Am I correct about that?
Yeah, he's talking about the fact that there are people who need to rise, and if the class society doesn't let them rise, then the society suffers. This is the bit about natural arete. And
Yes.
then the converse is there are people who are way above their station who need to lower, they need to go down. And if the class system doesn't let them go down, then once again, society suffers. So you end up with a Caligula or a Commodus in power. That's somebody who has a Dulic or Banausic personality, as case may be. They need to go down. They can't possibly be running the reins of society because they're going to run society off a cliff to satisfy their appetites or their delusions. The converse is true as well. The issue about natural arete is, you may need the genius insights of some person who's going to become a Thales or who am I thinking of? Galileo, to help you to be more effective in war. And if you make that guy pick apples and don't let him develop theories of the motion of bodies fired through the air, you're never going to develop the cannons that allow you to defend yourself against the superior civilization. This is that issue of everybody's got different gifts, and society doesn't know which of those gifts it's going to need. So the smartest thing for society to do is to make sure that everybody's gifts are allowed to flower to whatever level they need to flower. And then that way you have a rich bounty of gifts lying around when a crisis hits you. And you can cast about and go, you, Galileo, get over here. Didn't you write some paper or another about cannons? I think we need that now, right? But if you never let him do that, then he's not an available resource for society, and the society as a whole is weakened. So this is what he's talking about. The way up for people who need to rise and the way down for people who need to sink have to be part of the structure of the class society. And if either one is missing, or God help you, if both of them are missing, then you have a society that can't adapt to change. It can't get rid of problems, and it can't embrace opportunities. So that's really what he's talking about in that third sentence.
But that's the reality, because the power structures of a society, I don't know about in the time of Greek, but certainly in the moderns, it's not enhancing, it's suppressing.
Right, exactly. And this would be the critique of why modernity is way past its peak, because these Hegelian epochs, when an epoch is new, it's weak, it's in trouble, it's the upstart going up against the whole massed power of the old epoch, and the old epoch has massive momentum and resources. So the new rising worldview is a lot like the way the Germans were in the North. It's sort of like right on the edge. It's barely making it. And it can't afford to be making gigantic blunders in the structure of society. And so under those conditions, the ones who are too rigid simply fail. And the movements that take their place are the ones that are more dynamic, because those are the ones that are able to let people rise and fall to their own level of competence, rather than rigidly enforcing either kind of injustice. So this is how you can measure where we are in our arc. We don't have to predict the future. We can just, this is one of those, it's like taking somebody's temperature or blood pressure. You can see the failure to let people rise and fall that's present. And you can contrast it with how things were in the 1400s, 1500s, when modernity was new. And you can see just from that, just as clearly as taking a temperature, you can see where we are in our arc. We're well past the peak. And that rigidity, if Hegel's right, is just going to grow more entrenched right up until it falls apart, because we're becoming less like an animal and more like a stone. We're not responding to change well. Yeah. It's a critical point. Thank you, Sharon. And so, by that critique, Aristotle talks about a bunch of these things. But by this critique, effectively, without ever having met us, without ever really predicting that we were ever going to exist, the Greeks have critiqued our health and our sickness in advance. And they did it because they were critiquing their own history and their own course on their arc, and seeing the problems with it. And they wrote about it in such a way that rather than being parochial, it ends up being generalizable to other societies and other times, even 2,500 years later. The same tools and techniques, we can apply them to look at modernity and go, ooh, just like the Athenians became too rigid once they had all that money pouring in through the Delian League after the Persian War, so we've become too rigid now that we have these giant concentrations of capital that don't want things to change because it would endanger their wealth. We've got a different reason, but it's actually related, right? I mean, it was the money in both cases. It was the doing too well. And thus we get Nietzsche, power makes stupid, right? You start thinking, I could give up this money and go back to doing things the hard way, but I remember those days and I was always stressed out and I didn't sleep well. And sometimes I was homeless, and I don't really want to do that anymore. So I'm going to do things the stupid way, which is I'm just going to throw money and power at the problem. And so people do, right? It seems like a solution. I've had times in my life when I had money and times in my life when I didn't have money. And the times when I don't have money, I have to be a lot smarter than the times when I do have money, because I can't just throw money at a problem. In a nutshell, this is the fundamental driver of what's being talked about here. The rigidity versus the fluidity is caused by these differing circumstances. Yeah. Okay. Great stuff, Sharon. Thank you. Donald, what's on your mind?
In that third sentence,
yeah,
I think a posteriori is probably the most important two words.
Yes.
That they don't have a theory that they can use to predict, who's going to be whatever, just like you said, what they'll need or who should rule. It's not like, the divine right of kings, and we can predict then that the oldest sons of this line are going to be the best. They actually have to look and see. And this is back to where we started with Kenneth here. You're either existentialist or escapist. A posteriori is the kind of reasoning open to the existentialist. He has to see what comes into existence. The other thing is, Fusus could leave us SOL at a time when we need it. We can't summon from nature. We're not conjurers. You know, the leader we need when war breaks out, or our financial system is going to crap. Oh, that seems like we could use one now, but apart from that, you know, this is one. We might not say, I know most Americans wouldn't say a posteriori because they can't pronounce those words, but it's like sort of pragmatic. We would kind of say, yeah, but we do. We have to look, and that's very important. That I mean, if that were changed to a priori, this sentence would be very different, or if it was omitted so that it could be either. But it's explicitly, we must look and see. We must see what nature gives us, and what we can do with that. It's, yeah, that's enough. I don't know where he got this stuff about hubris or idiot self misevaluations. I almost never see people that think they're better than they are. I mean, you know, who would
I'm the
make
king of the world.
who would make that mistake?
I crown myself emperor. Woo!
Oh, yeah.
So can I just ask a question here? So what you're saying, Donald, they must look, and the look is like a retrospective analysis. Is that it?
Yes. Yes. Because what they're talking about is the difference between the man with the hammer who decided in advance that every problem's a nail. And therefore, when he looks at the world, he sees nails everywhere. And he's like, not that kind of looking. The other kind of looking, where you don't go in having decided in advance what you're going to find. Go in and look honestly, ready to be surprised by nature. That's a posteriori, after the fact, after the things have happened, just to see what happened. And that's what he's emphasizing here, is that they did not that their ideology told them that nature had to be this way, but that they found it in nature when they honestly looked.
Yeah. We don't know how fast the fastest man could run until a man runs. You know, or how beautifully one can sing, or how well one can write. This is an extension of that starting place.
Yes.
Where we were on existentialist or escapist.
Right.
Do you delude yourself into thinking you know these things in advance?
Right.
Do you fall into some ideological thinking, or can you unblind yourself? Oh, who have we seen that got blinded himself? We need to unblind ourselves and see what nature has given us.
Yes.
I'm not claiming I can do this. All I'm claiming is I think that's what this sentence means.
I think that's what the sentence means. I mean, the classic distinction between a priori and a posteriori in a conversation between me and Sharon is that if I say I would make a great anesthesiologist, that couldn't be more a priori. I've never tried in my life to be an anesthesiologist. You know, this is some escapism right here, right? I'm escaping from reality and making claims. Whereas if Sharon says, I have been a great anesthesiologist, that's a posteriori. She has an entire career behind her to look back at and go, yeah, I you know, the evidence is bountiful that I was able to do that. So that's Sharon, when she says that she has been a great, you know, anesthesiologist, she's engaging in existentialism rather than an
Yes. But the outcome from all of this is it needs to be whatever the analysis comes up with shows it has to be held in check for the sake of the higher structures of orders. This is what I'm saying. It's all about the power.
Yes. Well, and what he's saying needs to be held in check is the idiotism and the hubris.
Yes.
So it's the people who misevaluate themselves and say, I should be the king of the world. I should be the emperor. Those are the people you have to hold in check.
Well,
Because if you don't hold them in check, everything's
throughout my entire career, I told my boss that I should be in charge, of course.
Of
You know,
course.
I mean, well, if I only ran this
Say, what did
company,
he say?
I hold this truth to be self-evident.
but the difficulty I think here is really how do we obtain that degree of judgment that we identify
Yeah.
a person who's misevaluating
Right.
themselves,
Right.
and how do we obtain authority to say, okay, we know you think you should run the country, but why don't you go home and try and just mow your lawn, take care of your lawn.
Let's see how you do it back.
You know,
Step
it's one of
one.
those quotes. I don't really much. I'm not endorsing Lyndon Johnson, but at one time, one of his famous quotes is, "I'd feel better if the man had once been elected dog catcher."
Right.
You know,
At least no.
some step where he shows that he had been able to do something.
Yes.
You know, one person once told me, he said he said there were, I think, 3 classes. I don't know if I can remember them all, but they're not the 3 Greek classes. They're like workers, watchers, and worriers. And well, 2 of those are just sitting around worrying about what the third one or watching the third one's doing. You know, it's kind of that way. You know, you need to, who is actually doing, who a posteriori,
Yeah.
in fact, is actually seen to do stuff
Right.
that makes the society or their family or whatever better.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
enough.
Yeah, I mean, if you want good advice on what to do with your garden, you don't ask the person who's never grown a garden. You ask the one who's got the best garden. You say, "How did you do that? I want to do what you did." Right? You're looking a posteriori. You know, existentialist approach to knowledge. This is the core of real science, as opposed to ideological science. You know, like it's why archaeologists all say, don't get into biblical archaeology. It's the worst. Because everybody goes in with an ideology and a point to prove. You know, we're gonna prove that we have located, you know, Jesus's final resting place. We're gonna prove that we've located, you know, where Joseph and Mary stayed at the inn. And you know, if you're determined to prove it, you'll find it wherever you look. You know, people find it all over the Middle East. You know, because they were a priori, they decided in advance what their discovery was going to be, and then it was just a matter of, you know, connecting the dots until they could draw a little picture and say, "Yep, that sure looks like it." Whereas real archaeology is a posteriori. And, you know, you start by saying, "I don't know what's here. Let's just find out what the evidence tells us." And should there be an overwhelming wave of evidence that says, "Oh my God, this is in fact where Jesus was born," that's totally different from going in advance, you know, and going to downtown Manhattan and looking in a basement, sure that you're going to find, you know, the manger and the creche, and lo and behold, you found it. You know, well, of course you did, but you know, dude, you're on the wrong side of the planet. You know, it's like the only reason you found it is because you're a man with a hammer who sees a nail everywhere you look. So that's a big part of this, existentialist versus escapist. It's all over this, and it's in that a posteriori term. And of course, even though Kenneth's not saying it, katafuse is all over this sentence, right? Why would the Greeks find it compelling evidence to look at the aggregate results of human preference and self-limitation and find patterns there? Why would they find that? Because nature's the ultimate authority on truth. Truth as, you know, nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. Section A and G sets up that this sentence is unreadable. It's incomprehensible in the correct way without that framework to read it as, to know that that's how the ancients see it. You don't need a persuasive argument. You don't need logic. You don't need math. You just need nature to show you what it's actually doing. And if that's what it's doing, then I guess it must be true. This must be how people are, right? This must be how a society should operate. It's got to be able to fix these things. So this is like there are fragments of Heraclitus that don't get quoted as often because they're even more cryptic than the ones that do. And one of his is the way up and the way down are the same way, he says Heraclitus. And people think, was he just talking about a path up a mountain? And of course it's to say, why would it be two different ways? But in part, he's talking about these phase changes, from solid to liquid to gas to fire, and back down from fire to air to liquid to solid. He's saying it's a single set of relationships that operates the same way. And it's part of his argument that there's a single logic underlying all of nature, and that it operates according to rules and intelligence, and that things are measured. He talks about things kindling in measures and going out in measures. But he's not just talking about, remember the Greeks, what Kenneth's talking about here is that the Greeks are generalizing, like Phil was saying, they're making a metaphor from that to human character. And so he's also talking about the way up and the way down for human beings within a society, the class system, that you need to have an underlying logic within your society and its class system to ensure that people's natural arete allows them to rise to the level of their competence. If they've been held too low in the class system, they've got to be able to rise. And by the same token, people who have artificially been inflated to a higher position than they're qualified to hold, that same system, in order to mimic nature properly, has to allow them to sink down to whatever the natural level of their character is. And that's how you create the most just society, is where everybody finds their own level according to their character and their teleology. And that's when people do the most good for each other and for society and for themselves under those conditions. And this is the point Kenneth's making in this section. This is deeply anti-modern. We don't believe any of this. We believe in a classless society. We should give everybody a chance at the steering wheel of the Titanic. Only good things could happen. Somebody believes he can take on an iceberg. Let's give him the wheel. Why not? Who are we to say that crashing the Titanic and murdering a whole bunch of people is a bad thing? Good, bad, who can tell? We have these crazed ideas about how the world should work. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, both discussions have been interesting, so it's hard to choose which one to continue on. But it seems to me, if you're a person that is interested in a posteriori, then in a sense, in a contemporary society, it almost seems you have to figure out how to maneuver in the structure that doesn't allow you to rise your level. I remember, and I might have told this story before, but quite often I tell my students, like you live in a culture that, in a sense, acknowledge to fake it until you make it. And I say, like, from my analysis, society seemed to have a degree of respect for your abilities, but there's always a kind of ranking, and I use a military metaphor in that sense. So, like, you usually could arise through the faker thing and through your connections with structure of society to maybe about 3 levels above your abilities. And you could be deappreciated by about 3 levels. So there's a contrast of 6 different levels. And I've always considered myself as somehow figuring out a way to be satisfied with being slightly lower than I deserve, which is fine, And the way I justify that is, of course, if I was, that I deserve to, let's say, be a colonel or lieutenant colonel, that means that on some level, I might be lower all the way down to, let's say, major, lieutenant, first lieutenant, no, captain, first lieutenant. Okay, so I would be a first lieutenant in that category. However, the lieutenant general that is faking until he makes it and with all the connections, probably could rise to colonel, brigadier, and major general. Okay. So the contrast between that is extreme, and you understand that. But I tell them, yeah, of course it would be better to get the pay and the respect, so forth, whatever. But imagine how anxious you are every day, And let's say you're the lieutenant. Somebody asks you a question, whether you don't know or whether you pretend you don't know it. You said, "Hey, that's above my pay grade. Why don't you go ask the general?" I believe he's hiding in the closet because he's afraid that somebody would ask some question of that sort. So the only rebuke he has in a case that a question that should be easily answered by a lieutenant general, he doesn't have an answer for. So he's going to avoid that. The only retribution he could have is he's going to send you to the brig, right? There you go. You go in the prison for a month or whatever. And so that's a terrible life to live. You get the money, I guess you get to stand in the ovation stand when the people march and all that, but you live a terrible life. You know you don't deserve it, And so I'd rather be underpaid and still make out. Because I don't want to be busted all the way down to a private. So I'll say that much. But I think if you accomplish yourself to a degree that you have a degree of talent, I think people will recognize it, even in this society, to a degree, that they're not going to bust you to a buck private.
Yeah.
So that's the way I deal with it, and I see that's always the case in society. So I've always been able to survive, although I'm reasonably sure that I'm not getting the kind of reward that I deserve, but that's okay. For instance, I never in my job have ever asked for a raise. Never. And not because I'm afraid to confront people, but it's just sort of like I just figure it's coming to me at some point, that's it. Whereas people, they always teach you to go and argue for a raise, and I never did. And I'm doing okay. I'm satisfied with it. Okay. So I'll answer that in that sense, that if you're in a situation where obviously society is not going to reward you, you have to find a way to find a comfort zone that you could survive in and still do what you do with a lot of confidence. And in fact, exceeding your confidence. That's it. So.
Thanks, Phil. Sharon, you have something you'd like to add? Come off mute and tell us about it.
Sorry. I want to follow up on something that Phil said, because it's right here. To the Greeks, society must not commit violence against natural potential, coercing some by artificial domination and protecting others by a naturally illegitimate system of privilege. That's how they kind of maintain, I think, and you can correct me, the power structure. Human society does not produce the ultimate matter or resources or form that define character. It merely plays the hand that nature deals it, generation after generation. And we're back to that again.
Yes. This is what Donald was alluding to, this issue that when the crisis comes, and it comes in some unpredictable form for the society, and it demands certain gifts of arete, your society is only going to make it if you have been cultivating forms of arete despite the fact that they don't have any immediate practical use, because this crisis didn't exist before. So you didn't need those gifts before. You need them now, but it's too late to develop them now. They take forever to develop. The only way to be sure that you're ready for the unpredictable crisis that comes is to produce a wide diversity of arete, even things that aren't immediately useful, but things that you can clearly recognize as it's some kind of gift, even if it's not an immediately useful one. And this always puts, and Sharon will recognize this, it always puts me in mind of the people who remind us that in the history of science, many of the greatest discoveries were found by accident, not by people looking for that thing. If they were looking for that thing, they never would have found it because that wasn't where it was. It was off connected to some completely seemingly unrelated area of research that led to the discovery in this other area that seemed to be disconnected. It's you have to be, that's the thing about semathesy. You have to be like high tuned, keyed into the world around you. You have to be exploring, trying things, developing things, planting a rich bounty of many different crops. You can't be planting a monoculture of Cavendish bananas, or else one virus comes along and takes out everything you've got. You've got to have a lot of different gifts around for, someday when they might be needed. You have to be eclectic, but committed to your eclecticism. And obviously, that you can't do that only and not also produce the basics that are required by a society. But in this case, this is an aspect of nature that we can mimic, that the Greeks didn't have the scientific background to mimic, but they just sort of naturally got there by a different direction, which is this idea that in any species, the most successful members of that species form up the center of your bell curve. That's most of your population. But at the edges of your population, every species maintains a very large variety of diverse mutations off of that bell curve. And sure, now they're suffering, right? They're not perfectly in line with what you need now, so they don't rise to the top of society. But they're there. And so that if conditions change dramatically and the center collapses, maybe one of your many peripheral available options is going to have the arete you need to deal with this new circumstance. And then they'll swell to become the new center of the bell curve, and develop its own variants around it. That's how species survive for, hundreds of millions of years. That's how they do it. And of course they do it by changing. As Heraclitus says, things only rest, by changing. And this is how species evolve over time. So this katafuse, according to nature, way of structuring society offers us these kinds of options, but only if we're willing to that first sentence that you read us, Sharon, not commit violence against natural potential. Not commit violence against natural potential. If nature has given us these gifts, we may not have a good use for them now, but let us not squander them, because we may have a use for them later. We don't know what the future brings. And the moment when our power and privilege make us stupid enough, as Nietzsche warns us, to begin thinking that we're masters of creation, that's when we're setting ourselves up to become too rigid and to try to purify ourselves, right? These purification campaigns. If we were only a pure society, not infected by diversity, then we would be stronger. So we run around stamping out all the variants and making sure only the center of the bell curve survives. And then when the crisis comes, there's no other arete. We got rid of it all in our purification campaign. And so we have no response to the new crisis. This is how people can do a thing that species don't do, which is we can basically commit suicide on an evolutionary scale. And it doesn't occur to wolves to run around and exterminate all the wolves that aren't exactly like themselves. No, only Noesis can come up with these kinds of stupid ideas. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, a lot of the issues being brought up here, you've got Jordan Peterson, who gains an enormous amount of flack in the modern world. And I don't know why. You could You could regard Jordan Peterson or you could disregard him. That's your choice. But the hostility, you got this sort of slightly amusing guy and the level of hostility which gets placed against him. And he brings up this issue all the time. He brings up that word, the C word, competence. And there's a lot of people in this world that don't want to hear that word. And we've all at various stages of our lives sort of imagined that we can be something far beyond our ken. You probably experienced it playing Dungeons and Dragons quite a lot, but actually I've got the map to Greyhawk somewhere. Remember they all got excited when, finally we've got the map of the world, Greyhawk, it's there. But there's imagining things and there's actual practice. And a lot of what's going on with a lot of people is a lot of imagining stuff and not actually engaging in practice. It's practice that's going to reveal the reality. And sort of, I don't know, if having any sort of a talent or doing any sort of job well takes effort, generally, things just don't fall into your lap. But there's a lot of people going around today who think it's just things falling into your lap. It's a bit like the story, a fool and their money are soon parted. If you don't have the talent for money, you can be given money and you'll still wind up with zero. But today it's this Oedipus quality. The Oedipus quality is, in the third stage, we have a man who's created an external element. He's created the stick that enables him to wander around the world and test circumstances for the case of his blindness. We've created a structure. This is something the Tolkien's notice. There's a particular Norse saga in which the protagonist or the antagonist is this demonic sword, which passes through generations. And the Tolkien's notice this has never been seen in any tale before, but it's become commonplace today. We have the human creation, the robot can become the chief element in a tale. You saw it in the heavy metal cartoon where you have the evil orb, which is the center of all the stories. Some people can resist its temptation, but most succumb to its temptation. And it's this element which somehow gets overlooked. Everyone, in their fictional story, they think, oh, life's going to be easy. I'll get everything I want. I don't have to exert myself. I don't have to change myself. There's a difference between our inner self and externals. And I think what Jordan Peterson was saying, before you try to rule the world, learn how to clean up your own bedroom. And I think a lot of people get the attitude that if I get that external, in society, we've created an external. We've created the president's chair. We've created a Capitol House where with all the beautiful furniture and all the physical things there, which are the sticks we lean on. The trouble is, once you've created the chair, once you've created all these objects, any fool thinks that if they sit in that chair, they're the president. In the older times before those structures were there, you soon found out whether a person was worth their medal. But once you've got all those structures, once you've all got all those crutches people can lean on,
Right.
you're not so sure any longer. I put this guy in the president's chair, Bush Jr. is obviously going to be a genius leader. He's sitting in the chair. He's the man. But it's this inability to understand the risks that comes with institutions. When you create institutions,
Yes.
you've created this external structure. You've created this crutch.
Yes.
I don't know. I'm starting to wonder is this the meaning behind the downfall of Oedipus?
Right.
Oedipus is one of those guys. He's a warrior. I've smacked the previous king out of place. I've defeated the monster. I've married the queen. Hey, I'm the dude.
I'm the dude. I'm
After
winning.
that, everything fell apart.
Right.
You know, when Oedipus is going, what's wrong with the world? And Tiresias goes, you know, even though I'm a blind man, I can see what the problem is. And you with two good eyes are missing the point.
Yes. Yes.
You know, if you have a tool like eyes, you need to learn how to use them.
Yeah.
A man who has good eyes but doesn't use his eyes is no better than a blind man. That was the significance of Oedipus's tale.
Far worse, in fact. Yes.
But this is it, you know, Jordan Peterson, they don't like him. And he's just basically telling them, you know, think about changing yourself before you try to change the world. But people don't want to hear that. The child doesn't want to hear that. The child wants to remain rigidly with what it's learned. And of course, when you get older, that changing your behavior or changing the way you act gets harder, it gets more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And this just seemed to be somebody, you know, somebody said, Steiner, yes, Rudolf Steiner, he said that that's the trouble with socialism, which was very hot around the time of World War One. Have you ever noticed that the people that go around screaming socialism are the most anti-social people you could ever meet? They want the social, but they're not prepared to go the inner path to finding the social. They want it on the outside. They want society to do everything for them. They don't want to go through that inner transformation. And this seems to be what is afflicting the Western world now, that the Western world rose to the top, or America's risen to the top. America displaced the British Empire. And it's got the wealth and it's got the power. But the political leadership of America was always a bit questionable, because the British seem to have a system that they much more vetted their leadership. You had to show something about yourself, because America's the land of the free. Anybody can be president. Oh, this was the point you're making, of course, with Kafka, wasn't it? Kafka thinking this is just complete lunacy. What's wrong with these people?
Yes. Yes. Why would it be the case that anybody could be president? Why would that be true?
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I'm going to call on, I saw a wave of hands come, but I'm first going to throw this out there. Chaos versus cosmos is one of the core recurring themes of the ancient Greek worldview. And, you know, we remember that the roots of this are that as long as the Greeks acted as individuals just competing with each other, they tore themselves to pieces and the world around them. It was when they learned to act as a cosmos, when they learned to harmonize their principles. What were they doing? Why were they doing it? What were the ultimate goals? That the chaos turned into a cosmos, and they became the most effective fighting force of their generations, and were thus able to sweep down in these invasions that to the people they displaced seemed barbaric. They came in and took over the power structures left behind during the Dark Age by the Mycenaean collapse and the Minoan collapse and so forth. So they were always obsessed with what is the difference between chaos and cosmos. And what's striking in the paragraphs that we're working our way through here is that we're describing highly ordered, rigid societies, which to a modern sound like order, right? It sounds like the opposite of chaos, right? It's order, right? There's rules about who's able to be what and so forth. But to the Greeks, it's a chaos because the rules and the structure and the rigidity are out of sync with nature. There is this concept of natural order versus artificial order, and that it's only an enduring, organic, natural order if the rules of order correspond to the rules of nature. If there's a mismatch, then you get that caste rigidity we were talking about. And now it's an unjust society, doubly unjust, because unjust rulers can't lower to their level of true competence, and because people with natural arete that's being suppressed can't rise to the level that's required for them to bring their arete into bloom for the good of society. And that these two ills together are enough to take down what apparently looks like a powerful, well-organized society. This idea is hard for moderns to grasp, that sometimes order is chaos. In fact, maybe even most forms of order are actually forms of chaos. The only ones that count as a cosmos are the ones where the forms of order correspond to the actual intrinsic nature and character of all of the elements involved. If it doesn't do that, it doesn't matter what other order you've got. It's an artificial order, and it's going to fail because it's a chaos. We don't have the ability. To us, order and chaos is a one-dimensional line, and you can be somewhere on that line. But to them, it's two-dimensional because they've got chaos versus cosmos as another dimension of the problem. And they say that's the critical one. This is what Aristotle's doing when he talks about the three forms of government, and then says, but I was lying, there's actually 6 forms of government. Because the question is, does the one or the few or the many, do they have principles? Are they a cosmos? Or is it just an unprincipled mob voting on who they want to eat for lunch? Then it may look like a democracy, but it's just a chaos. This is the distinction he's making between the good and bad forms of government as chaos versus cosmos. And so this is the reaction that they would have to a rigid caste system. So all of this is intrinsic in this, and of course intrinsic in this as well, without them ever having to say it, because they didn't know we were going to come along. This is their critique of modern slavery. That if you just run around a continent kidnapping whoever you can and dragging them halfway across the world and making them labor in your fields, well, those aren't douloi you have in your fields. Those are andropodon you have in your fields. You've captured scientists and generals and philosophers and all of these people, and you're making them dig up potatoes. This is not an orderly society, right? There's no cosmos here. This is a chaos. It only looks like an ordered society on the surface. And it's not at the surface that you can understand nature. You have to look for the underlying archive and the principles. And are they expressing themselves well? And they would say that, what we did in our forms of slavery, industrialized slavery, where anybody, who had the right skin or the wrong skin could be captured and enslaved, that's not slavery as they understood it to be. That's not the just system that they were trying to create. And thus we run into the problem. Every week, we talk about this. For 2-3 years, we've talked about this. English is a problem. It's not just words like free will and determinism and philosophy that we have trouble with, or thinking, or the mind. Even words like slave. It's a catch-all. Just, unjust, in between, orthogonal, everything could be called slavery or a slave. And we treat them all exactly identical. Whereas to the Greeks, the most essential thing is, what is the justice of the matter? Are you doing justice to people's natural character, to what they want to grow into internally? If you're not doing justice to that, it's a completely alien system from what they were striving to create. but in English they look like the same thing because we spell it the same way. We have not only eroded subtle distinctions, we've eroded what the Greeks considered to be the most essential distinctions that separate justice from injustice and called them this by the same name. And thus they call us barbarians. It's like it's when someone opens their mouth and speaks in English, when it comes to these deep issues of ethics, it's gibberish. We're confusing all the things that should be distinguished from each other at the most fundamental level, which for them is chaos versus cosmos. And on top of that is justice versus injustice. So Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, as the discussion going through, I was thinking of this in relationship to actually, I hate to say it, the title of Heidegger's book, Being and Time. And I wonder whether human beings are trapped in a kind of temporality. And in that sense, there seem to be three pillars that contemporary society is living in that might be very different from the Greeks. One is the relationship between the near and the far. It's hard for us to see the far because what's near seems is right there. You know, it's pretty much present in the sense. The other factor, it seems to me, is a relationship between the one and the many. The one being myself versus the many being my society, or even in a broader sense, humanity. And the third dimension seems to me the relationship between efficiency and resilience. I think we have constructed a society that believes in the near and not so much the far. And we've constructed a society that believes in efficiency rather than resilience. And a society that, in a sense, focuses more on the one versus the many. And in some sense, I think, let's take the concept of efficiency, you know, particularly in relationship to time, you know. We become a very efficient society because we could pull things from the future into the present and spend it now. That's exactly why we have a surplus of stuff, and we think that's normal. But in some ways, it isn't normal, because what you'll do is you'll leave the burden of debt to your children and your grandchildren. Somebody's going to have to pay for it because you've used up all the copper. You killed all the animals. You destroyed nature. Yeah, it seems like there's plenty of stuff until you look at the Brazilian rainforest and it's disappearing because we need it now. And I think it does seem like you have a lot of stuff, but you're going to run out of stuff because it's going to be harder and harder to mine, even if there is some stuff left. Because they talk about the fact that, you know, in order to do what we need to do and continue on doing what we need to do, we're going to need probably 3 times as much copper. And the copper that's remaining is buried deeper in the earth. It's going to be much harder to get. So that would be, well, that's no problem. Let your grandchildren figure that out. That's a relationship to the one and the many. You don't even have a respect for your grandchildren, you know, let alone other people in the world that have less, and they're not getting any copper at all. The reason why they can't get any coppers, we could easily send our military over there and get it and bring it back. So the one and the many falls into that, and the efficiency there. Of course, relationship to the near and the far. I mean, yeah, we want to do it now, you know, and I think there's too many people that don't understand the relationship, even within themselves, the relationship of the near and the far, because like I'm constantly shocked. I mean, I excuse that there's a certain amount of people who literally cannot afford it. And sometimes I wonder why they cannot afford it. That the average American have less than $500 in their account. That means one major crisis, that's it. You know? And that's a near relationship to the far that's related to you as an individual, not even if you're discounting your children and everybody else in society. Like, how did you get there? You got there because you want the stuff now, you know. And so I think we're just trapped in this situation where we see the illusion. We think efficiency of getting the far into the near is going to sustain you, but it's going to actually dislocate the resiliency of what might be in the future to come.
Right.
And I think that's the problem that we all have. We can't think beyond the near to the far. We can't think beyond the self to others. And we think efficiency have made resiliency disappear. That's not true. That's simply not true. Apparently, I heard, I'm not sure if this is happening now, but the sun is about to flip on its axis, which means we might actually flip in the rotation of the Earth. I have no idea, but like, imagine what a catastrophe that would be. So I'll just say that, like, it's hard to live in a world that's kind of like, that might be the same reason why Oedipus had that problem, because he's certainly being very efficient in doing what he did until hit the cliff wall and it didn't work anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so the relationship of the near and the far, he didn't see far enough into the future in a way to see that he might run into the wall. So yeah, I think that just might be the limitation of human beings in general. I don't know, it's like, I guess even for somebody who's wise, like, if you don't care about society surviving, humanity surviving, or even your children surviving, why would you care? Because you're going to die anyway. You know, so you got to go beyond yourself in some sense, and it's hard to go beyond yourself to a certain degree because society's made it very difficult for you to see beyond that. So anyway, that's my thought. It's like,
Thanks,
yeah,
Phil.
that's it. So
Sharon, what's on your mind?
I just wanted to follow up on something that Stephen said, which is the last sentence in the paragraph, where it says, education and culture can feed or enhance the competence of each type, but they cannot endow primal drives or the talent of genius or arete. And that's the point that you were making, that it's an internal drive to make you who you are. And if you just sit aside, it's never going to happen. Is that what you were saying, or did I misunderstand it, Stephen?
Well, you can't simply give somebody a document saying you are smart
Right.
when you're
That's
not.
true. Yes.
That there seems to be this is this commercialization of education. The public wants a piece of paper saying that they're smart. We'll sell you one.
Surprise, surprise. Who could have foreseen that we would start selling those things?
Yeah, well, this is the downfall of education, isn't it? Where previously they probably had better standards of who is competent and who isn't. We could be in danger, but the belief is, of course, that our fancy machines will save us. Our medical programs will save us from human stupidity. And often it does work
Up to a
Ah,
point.
until it doesn't.
Until it
that's
doesn't.
right.
Yes.
When
is-
we need to use judgment, it does not work.
Yes.
Well, this is the danger of the machine. This is the danger of the tool. This is the danger the Tolkien's were talking about in this Norse tale, where you have this demonic magic sword. When we grab tools that make life easier for us, this was the warning in June, that the humanity, for example, they created intelligent machines, they had robots doing everything for them. But the human, the meat in the sandwich, declined.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, June was all about, well, we'll get rid of computers. From now on, people are going to have to use their brains. I went into a chemist, as a girl there, and she was trying to work out what half 25 was. And she got her fingers. This is 30 seconds. 30 seconds I was waiting until she worked out what half 25. And
Half of 25. Oh,
yeah. Well, this is just lack of practice. I mean, because I'm working away every day trying to keep a score on the amount of calories I'm having and failing. It's done wonders for my abilities in addition,
Yes.
retaining the mental.
Yes.
Because every day I spend, I have to add up some simple sums.
well, let me just
Yeah.
go ahead. Well, let me just say, computers and robots, all forms of mechanization, and I mean, toward the programmers in our company have limitations.
Yeah.
I mean, I have been in medicine where, we're going to have robots doing surgery, robots doing this, robots doing that, till the patient starts to bleed and you're in a vacuum and you need some judgment.
Yes.
And then it becomes a crisis.
Right. Right.
So if all's good, the machines can do the basic tasks. That's why I'm so interested in AI. But when it comes to judgment and finesse, we still need the human.
Yeah. Yeah. This is Kenneth Smith was making this point when I talked to him a week and a half ago. He was going back to that Gilbert Murray quote, the same one Donald mentioned a few weeks ago, about how modern societies have done a great job of making it possible for large numbers of people with no particular competence or virtue to lead seemingly ordinary lives. And, for decades, I wondered what on earth he meant by that. What was his thrust? Where was he going with that? But of course, part of where he's going is it means that the crucial institutions of society are populated by people who aren't very smart and aren't very good. Because they're able to pass, right? Society helps them to pass for being really competent and good. And we won't know the difference until a crisis hits, where simply being able to pass under normal circumstances isn't going to be good enough. And at that moment of crisis, when we're going to expect competent, good people to grab the reins of society and steer us out of the crisis, instead everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket because these people don't have those qualities. They only appear to, right? They're just passing. And that's how we've structured our society. I over and over, I go back to, it was one of my pivotal moments of insight into Kenneth Smith's existentialist philosophy. In the early days, I liked nice things and I didn't like mean things. And so I would read Kenneth at the very beginning with, well, what's he saying here? Is he saying nice things or is he saying mean things? And if he said mean things, I didn't like it. If he said nice things, I liked it. I'm talking about a much earlier stage in the development of my consciousness here. And you know, when I got his books of parables, I had already just started to clue in. There's a deeper level to this that was more profound. And so I'm reading, I think it's Otherwise, that has the parable about two cars collided in an intersection. It was tragic. Oh no, it's two cars collided in an intersection. Buildings collapsed for blocks around. It was a catastrophe. And then the final sentence is, the builders had been counting on a hurricane to hit first. And I didn't like that parable at all for a long time because it sounded mean. And eventually I came to understand the deeper insight, which is that we've got a problem. Everybody's playing a giant game of chicken in which they're cutting the standards more and more. They're hollowing out all of the institutions that keep society going.
They're faking it until they make it.
Except without the making it. They're just faking it, taking the cash and running. And they're really hoping that a big disaster will come along and knock down all those houses. And then everyone say, oh, the houses fell down because of the hurricane. Well, that's understandable. But the houses shouldn't have fallen down from the mere impact of two cars in a nearby intersection. But that's how much they hollowed out society, that it was that fragile. And so what the builders hate about this is that they're being exposed. They don't mind if people suffer. They just don't want to be exposed as the cause of the suffering because they made everything in such a shoddy way. But that doesn't stop them. It doesn't make them want to make things in a good way. That just doesn't even occur to them. Everything is about this big game of chicken and trying to extract as much as you can from the world and society. It was when I started to understand that I didn't have, up until then, the appetite for critiquing our actual existential situation because it's ugly. And I didn't want to look at ugly things. I only wanted to look at pretty things. I realized that I had blocked my own development by this appetite for what's nice and pretty and this aversion to what's ugly. But you know, once you learn to look at it, you can start to see that there is a logic. It's not just chaos. There is a logic and structure and systemic organization to the problems that we have. It's not just that we're hoist on our own petard. We're hoist on our own petard in very specific, organized ways. And that means something could be done about it. It's not just a monster from the id coming to devour us. It's something that can be anatomized and diagnosed and treated, you know, if once you understand what's happening, like any other disease, a cultural disease. But yeah, now I understand the sense of humor that goes with, you can look at the ugly thing, diagnose it, and it can crack you up. It's like, man, it's like when you watch little kids doing something absurd that they habitually do, and they're your kids, and it's like, yep, there they are doing it again. It's hilarious. I hope they grow out of it. You know, and I got to make sure I put limits on it so they don't do any permanent damage. But it's kind of hilarious that there's a stage of development where this makes sense to them, and they're doing this crazy thing. That's kind of where we are as moderns. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Maybe very little. I just wanted to point out that my two favorite types of slaves are wage slaves and debt slaves. You know, we have lots of slaves. If you count addiction, we get a whole lot more slaves. So modern society is full of slaves, people that, for the most part, don't rise to the point where they realize they're enslaved. The other is, Stephen's been talking a lot about competency and hierarchy, and there's some statistics that about the United States and United States history that I've always found. I read a lot of military stuff, and George Washington rose to the rank of lieutenant general. And we have some idea about what he did in winning the War of Independence. In the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant rose to the rank of lieutenant general. And he commanded, at that time, the largest army, probably larger than any army we've had apart from World War II. And we know what he did. He won that war, you know, largely commanding. And what boggles me my mind now is that there are 64 lieutenant generals in the Pentagon, which are supervised by 15 four-star generals. And I haven't got a clue what they do. We've seen what just 2 lieutenant generals could do in history. They could accomplish phenomenal things, but maybe not so anymore. Maybe, I don't know. I think there's I think it was his, you know, give the man the chair and see what he can do. You know, I don't know. I think we have lost some ability to get competence. I mean, I mean, many critiques of meritocracy are valid because they're not trying to judge real merit.
Right.
They are used as exclusionary sleight of hand. But there is something about, if you've ever, I was thinking about it when Stephen was talking about confidence. I was once on a project where we were going to build a cryptographic box for a radio or something like that. I don't remember the exact details, but the project leaders got up. So I'm a senior engineer, and he says, I want you guys all to sit here in front of this blackboard for a little bit. If we're going to do cryptography, you guys need to know something about cryptography. He went through Euler's work on prime number closed fields and how taking inverse of prime numbers in that, the difficulty. He talked about RSA and Diffie-Dilson exchange of initial parameters in order to generate secretly the same key at both ends in ways that couldn't be cracked and stuff like that. And it's one of these things, when you see somebody and you sit there and listen who actually knows what they're doing, it's like, wow, this is amazing. I didn't, I mean, I had the sort of big picture from reading some books, but this guy, he really knew it.
He
knew it. He didn't need a book. He could stand there extemporaneously in front of a group of good engineers and lecture them on the technical knowledge they were going to need to succeed in this project.
Right.
And it was like, wow.
Authority.
Yeah. And so I think there is, from my own experience, there is some real idea of competence. We may have lost it, but gosh, when you see it, and you see people that
it's unmistakable when you encounter it.
Right. I mean, so we it's not like charisma,
That's leading people by the nose.
Yeah. Well, I just have these things because I think that we can't just we can talk about competence. I've never talked to. I've watched some of Peterson. Jordan Peterson makes lots of videos, and I've watched some of them, and I think he takes a lot of flack, not necessarily for saying competence, because I don't know. When I've seen him, he's got a good general education, but he's not that deep. But when he gets into philosophy, he's not that deep. He jumps into physics and he's not that deep. And then whatever, and he gets away from it. But he probably should be more ignored than vilified. You know, it's just, oh, never mind. Sorry, Stephen. I shouldn't even have brought that up. It's totally irrelevant.
On that note, why don't I'm going to call on Phil in a second, but why don't I first drop paragraph 7 in, because we finished paragraph 6, lo and behold, and we are now on to paragraph 7. Hi, Elle, welcome to the call. I'm gonna drop it. We're on week 88, working our way through Kenneth Smith's book Millennia and Microcosm. We're in chapter 4, section G. I'm going to drop a link there. That's to the web page, and you can run through section G and see where we are. Overall, the premise of this book, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was originally published as a column in the back of the Comics Journal magazine, of all things, in the years leading up to 2000. And David and I are working on bringing it out as a book. And first, we're all going through it together, sentence by sentence, kind of pulling it, because his style of writing is very allusive. He's constantly alluding to other philosophers and writers, and he sort of expects you to go read them and figure out what they're talking about. And he's also very dense to read because he's using words in a very highly technical way, a very specific way. And so it takes us time to pick apart, sentences that make perfect sense to us when we first read them. It turns out we're misinterpreting because he doesn't mean by those words what we mean by those words. So in chapter 4, he's in a project to try to show us how the ancients saw the world differently than the way we see the world. He's trying to help us learn that worldview so that we can put it on and take it off and switch back and forth between our modern perspective and the ancient perspective. And then starting in chapter 5, he's going to do the same thing with the medieval world. It's going to take a few chapters to get to really understand the medieval worldview. But then by the time we get to the end of the book, when he's talking about the modern perspective, we'll be able to shift back and forth between 3 different worldviews and use them to critique each other, not just to see the world differently, but to look at each other differently. And that's the ultimate goal of this book, is to allow us to critique the water that we fishies take for granted because we swim in it, which is, what is the modern worldview? How do we see things? Well, the only way to answer that is to see what some other worldviews had to say about us so that we could start to question our assumptions. So we're currently working in section G. We're working on this issue of character and class, and how the Greeks thought that because people had different gifts, society had to be structured in such a way that people could express their gifts. And that meant it had to have lots of different niches for people. And we've been at this for a while. So Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, you guys been critiquing modernity quite a lot. I basically agree with what you're saying. What I'm concerned with is that is not only not elevating competent people in the right way, but it's actually almost seems to be, I won't quite go so far as being diabolical, but almost seems that way, of dumbing the population down. I was talking to a computer guy who's pretty deep into computers, and we were talking about ChatGPT. And I said, the problem, I sort of complained about it. And he said, no, you're not seeing it correctly. He said the problem is most people use it so they don't have to think. They just tell ChatGPT, I want this, and it does that for them. And he also teaches also, as well as being a computer nerd. He said they turn in these things and it's very obvious they hadn't thought about it. He said, but the right way to use it is to write the essay or the article yourself first, and then have maybe ChatGPT to give input as a kind of editor to say, maybe you should consider this, or maybe because ChatGPT actually has a lot of information, but not a lot of creativity except to regurgitate things. And he said, you need to start out with a certain amount of creativity and have a critique. I said that would be the right way, because you wouldn't lose yourself, just like have some actually have ChatGPT hand in the paper for you rather than you handing it in. So that's one instant. And the other instance I have is early on when I was teaching, not early, but pretty early on, I was teaching University of Vermont. And there were these two twin girls, and one was taking my class. It was foundational drawing, and her sister was taking another class, also in foundational drawing from a different teacher. And I gave her, I actually liked her, but I gave her like a B minus. And she came in and wanted to talk to me and complain about why I gave her a B minus. I looked at her portfolio again and talked about each one of them and explained why. And and she wanted an A. I said, look, I'll compromise, I'll give you a B. But this is not an A portfolio, I went on and on, and she just kept complaining and arguing. And finally I got to the point where she actually spilled the beans. I don't know if accidentally or not. She saw her sister's portfolio and hers. She knew that it was better. And her sister got an A. That was the real reason. And she wanted to know why. I said, look, I have no control over what another teacher does. It's academic freedom, So I am only responsible for what I do. And I said, in the final analysis, are you glad enough that you actually learn enough to understand that your portfolio is better than hers, rather than the fact that you wish you were as dumbified as you were before, and you didn't know, and that's why you thought it deserved. And so I think that's a problem. We have gotten people to be so dumb, they want to argue about something, even though they know it's not true, because they want to feel good. They also want to feel like they deserve it, And the fact is that I guess she didn't really complain that I didn't teach her right. It's that she didn't say, what gives you the right to give me a B? What the other teacher gave my sister the same portfolio, the same class, an A. And I said, I can't answer that, you might have to talk to the dean or whatever. And so that was the case, It turned out that the teacher was, he seemed like a decent guy, but it was interesting that I think behind the scene, he did not want me around, which brings that on to another situation, right? You do not want somebody who did not attack you directly, but by his mere existence show that there might be something wrong with you, And so that's the problem when you deal with a structure of society, is that, you don't want to make the bad guy look bad, particularly if he has power. So that's a problem. The whole structure is structured in such a way that is working against you, and it's working against the people that they're trying to teach.
Yeah.
Because they're incompetent, and because the students want to receive an A. Maybe they're right. Maybe, being a competent person in art is not as good as an A in the resume, because an A in the resume works
In
better
terms of
in
the market's
society.
rewards for them later in life. Yeah.
That's right.
Right.
So there you go. I mean, we have constructed a society, at least at this point,
It's full of
in
perverse
which
incentives.
a structure to dumb people down. They want to be dumb. No, they don't want to be dumb. They want the rewards of being dumb. And so there you are. So I just want to say that in relationship to that, not working against anybody who would be competent, but developing a structure that would ensure society remains incompetent.
Right. Thank you, Phil. And this is a theme that Kenneth Smith's going to get to over and over in this book is the way that, you know, he's painting us this picture of the Greeks really concerned about anthropoculture and the generation of a society in which whatever random assortment of gifts nature has seen fit to supply in the characters of the individuals who make up the population, you want to be cultivating a society that allows all of those flowers to bloom, so that when the crisis comes and you look around, you've got a lot of things to choose from. That they don't want to cultivate a society in which everybody's the same. Everybody's got the same one gift. You know, what are the odds that the crisis is just going to coincidentally be about that one thing? Well, they're pretty low. So you're reducing your chances you're going to survive the inevitable crises. And he's, you know, basically saying to the Greeks, that was such an obsession. He talks about in this paragraph, he talks about the term paideia. You know, it was such an obsession to the Greeks that if they looked at the modern society where we're all concerned about the opposite, mass producing human tools, you know, that we can interchangeably slot into different job positions and get rid of as soon as we need to, we think, you know, just swap them around, disposable things, they would have thought we were insane. This is like, don't we understand that every society is going to face crises that test it to the limit? And if you've stamped out most of the gifts that nature provided your population in order to homogenize them and make everybody the same, what you're going to end up with is the inability to tackle the crisis. You don't know if you need an artist. You don't know if you need a scientist. You don't know if you need a hard worker. You don't know what you need, because that's the nature of the surprises, right? Time is full of surprises. Something's going to come along we're not prepared for. And if the only things that we have in our society is the things that we decided in advance we would allow to be there, and we stomped out every other weed, then the result is we stomped out every other gift. And
Hey, Rick, you know, I hate to disappoint you. We're all temporary workers. We're going to be
yes,
replaced by machine. They don't need you. They just need the money and the machines. We're all temporary workers, replacement workers.
it's not a coincidence that, you know, the model for Homo sapiens in the modern world is that the brain is a computer and the body's a machine. We say, and food is fuel. We're reducing everything down to the level of disposable mechanization, only, you know, not just as a metaphor, but to reflect the actual value system, which is that it does treat people as disposable. And it's going to treat them as disposable whether they are or not. You know, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., anybody who comes along who has differing gifts, society, and if they try to act on those differing gifts, society is going to do its best. Modern society is going to do its best to refuse to acknowledge those gifts and to try to treat them as the disposable commodity it wants all people to be. Because modern society doesn't have the capacity to value things, you know, intrinsically according to their own merits. If it did that, it would have to restructure itself in a completely different way. And it doesn't, above all things, it doesn't want to do that. It really likes the concentrations of wealth and power the way they are now. This is how you know we're past our peak. If we were still rising to our peak, we'd be busy trying to adapt to reality and changing ourselves to be more and more effective. But once we reach our peak and we start to feel satisfied with our rewards that we have at the greatest levels of power in the society, then we become more concerned about losing what we already have. And so we start becoming concerned about ossifying society and preventing anybody from rocking the boat, you know, because that might mess things up. And, you know, thus there's a gun waiting for anybody who, a bullet is waiting for anybody who pushes too hard in a direction that threatens the concentrations of wealth. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'll make that point again. Donald Bat Jordan Peterson, you can like him or you can ignore him. I'm fine with that. If you think he's an idiot, I'm fine with that. What I don't understand is how this seemingly innocuous character has exploded a whole world. And I can't see anything wrong with him so much, but there's something very wrong with that whole world. Just because this guy's airing a few views, their heads are exploding. I literally see this, metaphysically speaking. The idea of Jordan Peterson, what the hell? Why are you worried about this guy? You can like him, you can dislike him, you can ignore him, you can pay attention to him, you can ignore him, but they want to shoot him. Why?
Surely it's the nature of echo chambers, right? That the echo chamber becomes the reason for its own existence. And so the reason for the argument in part is the argument. I mean, you know, we're on the internet to talk. So they talk.
Well, but I'm
But
going to
anyway,
say
I mean, it's a little askew from where we are right now in the text.
I'm just going to say something which cropped up. You know, so I'm running this little group, and anyway, a creationist is coming along to give a talk. And a guy I know, you know, is a scientist, goes, you know, I've got a creationist coming along to give a talk, and, you know, he's hardcore believer in science. And he looks at me odd. And then I saw this is the problem, where we have certain scientific opinions. This is the truth. You don't think anymore. You don't analyze. You don't look at a creationist argument and think, well, what's really going on here? It has to be wiped out. There is it's like the ancient priesthood now of science. This is the truth, and you only have this imagination, and you do not actually diverge from this picture of the truth. What is this?
This is chapter 5, man. I mean, when we get into medievalism, we're going to see the rise of the concept of genocide as the normal good that society is supposed to pursue. There is the belief that rises in the medieval epoch that the only way we can have peace on earth is to exterminate all other religions. For 1,000 years, that was Europe, and moderns are just the children of medievals.
But
And
if
so
we have a
idea of
chapter,
purification, the idea of purifying things and removing all of the pollutants, and exterminating diversity. We've been practicing this for 1,500 years. There's a reason why everybody does it. It may not be the reason they think it is. You know, it may be this momentum that's been carried through for 1,500 years. But that's a powerful motivation to try to remove.
Okay, I'm just wondering, you've got a local chapter of UFO believers. We're not just going to ignore them or go along for a laugh. We're going to send in the troops, round them all up, and send them off to a gulag for scientific heresy.
Yeah, that hasn't actually happened yet, as far as I know. People talk about these. They talk as though they were going to do that sort of thing, but it hasn't happened. But yeah, I mean, what you're describing is bizarre from an ancient perspective, right? The ancients would have been puzzled. As we've talked about, you know, the Greeks didn't go around exterminating other religions. They added them to their own. They're like, well, wow, you've discovered something I didn't know. How awesome. But to us, that's foreign and alien. We're used to the idea that there's one right answer and all the other answers are wrong, and you have to exterminate all the other answers to purify, you know, the world for the one true thing. Well, we got that from monotheism. And not just monotheism in general, we got that from the medieval approach to monotheism, which is there's only one right answer and all the others have to go. But we'll get into that, you know, and part of what's going to be interesting as we get into the chapters that follow is seeing how did that arise in an attempt to correct the things that went wrong in the ancient world. And that's where this really gets interesting for me, is in what ways were this kind of purity culture and this kind of globalizing campaign, how did that seem like the answer to the corruption of Rome? And that's what's going to make chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 so interesting. It's like the arc, you know, Hegel talks about the arc of each epoch begins with a promise. And the promise is so compelling that everybody buys into it. It's like we have to leave behind the old ways because they were suffocating us. They were killing us. And this holds the promise to fix what went wrong. And the question is, how is it that the arc of traversal that started by that promise and its wide adoption, how does that lead to the corruption in the end that so often is the embodiment of the exact opposite of the promise? And as Augustine said, if the medieval God is the way that we're going to fix our politics. How is it that by 1500, our politics are more corrupt than they've ever been before? You know what is the tragic journey, you know, that Homo sapiens goes through that leads us into these kind of arcs of reversal and tragedy, so that, you know, later we have to, you know, have another revolution to escape medievalism, just like medievalism was supposed to be our escape from the ancient world. So it's going to be interesting, but first we have to wrap up. First, we have to wrap up section G in chapter 4. So I guess we'll pick up paragraph 7 next week. So thanks, everybody. It's been a blast. I love our time together on Mondays.
This has been very, very good. Thank you, Rick.
My pleasure. I'm
Yeah,
looking forward
thank
to picking
you.
this up again next week.
Okay.
Have a great week.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.